Illya Sekirin is a Ukrainian-born naturalized Canadian volunteer, drone warfare practitioner, and author of Rise of the Machines, Drone Warfare in the Russia-Ukraine War Tactics, Operations, Strategy. He volunteered to fight for Ukraine in March 2022, trained as a drone operator, served on the front line, worked as a translator and researcher for the Ukrainian General Staff, and later became an unofficial advisor to members of Ukraine's Stavka, the high command body chaired by President Volodymyr Zelensky. Sekirin authored a paper that helped inform Zelensky's decision to create Ukraine's unmanned systems forces as a separate branch, and it is these topics we're going to be discussing today. The effectiveness and the practice of unmanned systems that has revolutionized warfare and has halted Russia in its tracks. Illya, welcome to the channel.
Hello, Jonathan. Thank you for hosting me on your channel.
It's a huge pleasure, and it's been a while since we first made contact. There've been a lot of trips to Ukraine since then, but I absolutely read your book. It's got extraordinary detail in there, and actually, we'll put a link in the description of the video because I think it's a book that everyone who is interested in why Ukraine is standing and why it is starting to roll Russia back. They will only really understand the reasons for that if they get to grips with what you've written about. Let's start with the book. Obviously, you've got this experience. You're able to influence many decision makers in Ukraine. Why did you feel that you had to also write a book to bring it, one presumes, to a broader public?
Well, the current Russia-Ukraine war is witnessing two major shifts. So there's a drone revolution going on. So there's a major shift and change in the character of modern warfare. So drones are responsible for 80 to 90% of all battlefield casualties and losses. And another major shift that's going on right now is a confrontation between totalitarian and authoritarian states, which include Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, against the free world, however cliche that may sound. And because of this drone revolution, this new technology can enable these authoritarian states to really push back against the democracies and to achieve their political aims by military means. And so I think it was really important to make the Western militaries understand and realize that the drone revolution is already happening and they need to adapt fast to it. So they need to develop their own unmanned systems forces and counter drone systems in order to be ready to create a deterrence against the authoritarian regimes. And was the main reason why I wrote the book, to share the experience of the Ukrainians and how they managed to essentially almost defeat, or at least keep the Russians from winning in Ukraine because of the drones. And this is how Western militaries need to adapt.
I think it's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because many look at it and go, oh, well, the front lines aren't changing, etc. And they use these words like stasis and so on, and stalemate. But that seems to not be the case. What you seem to have here is that it's taken extraordinary innovation and extraordinary changes in strategy, training, tactics, etc., in order to halt Russia in its tracks, to halt what was considered to be one of the largest armies in the world. Do you feel that this is sort of underrated, the achievement of actually bringing that monster to a halt? And potentially now we start to see it going a little bit into reverse.
Yeah, if you look at the pure statistics before the war, you will see that Russia outmatched Ukraine in every single department. So in tanks, in armor, in artillery, in human resources, in the size of the economy, in the size of the military budget, and so on and so forth. That's why the military analysts in the West made predictions that Kiev would fall within 3 days, but they did not take into account the resistance of the Ukrainian people as a nation. So it was not only the professional army that was coming to the defense of Ukraine. There were people rising all over the world, in Ukraine and all over the world to the occasion too, like myself. And so, and another thing that really helped the Ukrainians was the drone revolution. It came out of several factors, like the advancement of technologies in the civilian market. So Ukrainians started militarizing the civilian quadcopter, most popularly the DJI Mavic 3. for first for ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance purposes, but also for spotting artillery and doing damage assessment. And so I think that these drones, together with other sensors like satellite, made the battlefield transparent. And so it was very difficult for the enemy to concentrate their resources, as their manpower, their infantry, their armor, their artillery, on key sections of the front in order to create penetrations in Ukrainian front lines. And so maneuver warfare became almost impossible. So after 2020, late 2022, when the Ukrainians outwitted the Russians in the Kharkiv region and managed to free large swathes of the Kharkiv region, and then the Russians retreated from the Kherson region under Ukrainian pressure. After that, the drones have already started playing a major role. While it was artillery that was responsible for most casualties, it was the drone that was directing this artillery. So it was not the traditional artillery spotter like an infantryman in a forward position, observer position, directing artillery. It was the drone because it was easier to do with the drone. And then, of course, there were several iterations of the drone. So the FPV came of age in 2023, 2024, and Ukrainian heavy bombers of Baba Yaga type, like Vampire and similar systems. And also now, this year, we see that there's a rise in middle strikes, which have previously been missing, and they are really isolating the battlefield. And also a rise in, I think, land robots. So I expect a lot of progress coming from land robots during the current year.
Absolutely, and without giving details, I've seen some of those being sort of tested, and they're performing or starting to perform an extraordinary range of functions. Is this a key thing, actually, that let's dive into the sort of the main architecture, because of course Russia has also innovated in drone warfare. What Russia has brought is the capacity to scale. What Ukraine seems to have brought, certainly last year and the year before, is the ability to innovate, but scale has been something of a problem. How would you compare that sort of vertical versus horizontal approach to drone warfare? And are we now seeing a breakthrough on the Ukrainian side in that they're starting to bring to bear this, ferment of innovation, but also bringing sort of scale with it? And we'll turn to Brave One and the other mechanics of that in a minute. But first of all, vertical versus horizontal approach.
Yeah, there's always a trade-off between scalability and flexibility. So in order to have your systems adapt faster to the changing realities of the battlefield, like changing frequencies and counter drone measures, you need to have a good feedback between the frontline brigades and the manufacturers, and this works better when there's more competition between them. So you need to have hundreds of manufacturers of drone parts and a whole ecosystem. But on the other hand, if you want scalability, you would rather have fewer models, which are then scaled up, and you would have larger factories. But another thing that is keeping keeping Ukrainian from scaling faster than the Russians was that the Russians have advantage in long-range precision strikes, and so Ukrainian production had to be dispersed, and so you would need to have larger number of small workshops like garage types or some manufacturing facilities dispersed and hidden and concealed from the Russians, whereas the Russia could build large factories like their Shahid factory in Yabulaga, I think it's called, where the Russians are assembling most of their Shahids. So and there's always
Yellowburga, I
this,
think it's
yeah,
Yellowburga, I think it is,
yeah,
but
Yalabuga, yeah.
it's a huge facility, and of course they have a lot of students there, a lot of third world students being recruited. Um, yeah, we'll come to that in a minute because that's an interesting one. Why that's not necessarily been taken out, but yes, this huge sort of structured approach to knocking these things out at scale.
Yes, and so recently Ukraine has received an increased funding for its drone program coming from the EU countries too. But I think even more could be diverted towards drones. So just to give you a figure, out of the 90 billion euros that has been allocated, only a small fraction, maybe 5% was allocated to drones, even though they are the main killer on the battlefield and beyond in the rear areas. So I would advise the Ukrainian government to spend even larger share of the EU funds on on the military budget on drones rather than on some systems which have not performed well in the era of drone warfare, like the tanks. And the same mistake is being made on a larger scale in the countries that are increasing their military capabilities, like the Bundeswehr in Germany and the Polish army. They're buying a lot of tanks, a lot of expensive helicopters, and those systems are not really survivable on the modern battlefield. So instead of tanks, I would suggest them to buy attack robots. So for example, if we take the price of a tank like $10 million, Abrams tank, and how many hundreds of thousands of UGVs, unmanned ground vehicles, can you buy for the price of one tank? And it would take much more FPVs to take out 100 or 1,000 unmanned ground robots equipped with remotely operated machine gun than a single tank. And the same applies to attack helicopters. And so the whole structure and design force in the West should be changed in order to incorporate the lessons learned from Ukraine. And even but now I think the one of the mistakes that the Ukrainians made was to allocate too much money to long-range drones rather than middle strikes or even battlefield drones. So I would say about 80% of EU funds went to long-range drones, particularly to a company called Firepoint, which had some political connections, instead of the killer machines that are really important. And imagine the results of the drone surge we would have now if those if maybe 10% was allocated to the long-range drones, including Firepoint, but could be other companies too. And most of the funds were allocated to the middle strikes and to the frontline drones.
We won't comment on the accuracy of Firepoint stuff. I mean, certainly has great PR value, but we should probably stay away from some of the operational data, which is a little more interesting, perhaps. Let's focus on this middle strike because what we've seen, which I think is incredibly important and missed by many. I mean, ISW has covered it, George Barros, Insider, and a few other, publications that go into these details. But we've gone from having a zone of absolute transparency. First it was 20 kilometers, then 30, then 50. We're now reaching depths of 150 kilometers where logistics seem to become problematic, and this is really becoming an issue for the Russians, it seems, on the corridor down to occupied Crimea. So could you describe a little bit about what this sort of zone of transparency means, this kill zone means for logistics, and how important is it that, I mean, to your point, this may have happened sooner if other decisions politically been made, but it does seem to be extending now to a point where most of the Russian occupied territory and certainly the logistical routes are becoming extremely tenuous.
Yeah, so last year there was a realization in the Ukrainian higher military command and the Ministry of Defense that the middle strike was missing. So you had a lot of frontline drones and you had a lot of production capabilities for longer range drones, which are very expensive, by the way. But you really like the middle strike, and it's in this zone, like in the operational zone, 30 to 120 or more kilometers, where a lot of Russian assets are located. There are command posts, there are ammunition depots, there are oil and lubricant material. And so it was really important to have that capability. But once you've made a decision to create those drones to when you can produce them in mass, I think it can be half a year or more can elapse. And so once you make a decision to, okay, let's invest in middle strikes, like 1 year or so or a little less can elapse. And so, but it's really important that during the past few months, the middle strike has risen in importance. And it's really, and we need to really look at the geography here because it's one of the defining characteristics of war. And you see that Crimea is really in a vulnerable position just because due to the virtue of geography. So it's connected by a small isthmus on Perekop to the Arabatska Strelka to Ukraine. And if you cut this corridor, which goes, there's some highways connecting it to Rostov and railways. If you intercede the traffic going between them, you have Crimea isolated, which will result in uh, shortages of oil and other material for the war effort, as well as for the Russian occupying civilian organizations. And so this is one factor. And another thing is, of course, that you can use the middle strike to isolate the battlefield in order to achieve greater effects on the battlefield. So you isolate the zone of, say, up to 200 kilometers, and then you can have some more effective operations, both of defensive and offensive nature in the zone, in the south of Ukraine. But of course, the middle strikes hit all across the front line. So they hit the Donetsk region, the Luhansk region, and even Russia proper, wherever the assets are. But you can use concentrations of them in order to increase the effectiveness. So if you concentrate like most of the drones on the south of Ukraine, you have a greater effect, and you launch a defensive or offensive operation there. You have greater effect than if you would just disperse the middle strikes all across the front line pretty much evenly.
Well,
And
let's
so
turn. Yeah, sorry.
it's really important how you deploy those new capabilities. So you can use them effectively in concentrate. For example, if the Russians, like take drones in general, both battlefield and middle strikes. Traditionally, Russia and Ukraine has been developing its drone forces from the bottom up. So it was first the initiative of soldiers and officers and the private sector, but then the army started taking over. But still, it was dispersed. Those capabilities were dispersed pretty much equally along the front line and were used as an infantry support weapon. And starting with Kursk, Ukrainians, and I played some role in it, uh, concentrated their elite forces at an unexpected place and time against a place where Russia did not have a concentration of their counter-drone and drone forces. And this favorable correlation of drone forces in favor of Ukraine allowed its land units to essentially use the drone umbrella in order to pierce through the Russian defenses and to try to outflank their positions. And so it started at Kursk, and then the Russians saw that it was effective, so they started experimenting with similar concentrations of effort on the key areas, like it was Pokrovsk, where they first did it in the Group of Forces Center during Mordechev's generalship there. And we see similar with the Minister of Defense Fedorov taking charge of the ministry about 5 months ago. He really brought these ideas of concentrations of drone forces at key points to the planning of operations by the general staff, and he's using his influence on the general staff to promote those ideas, which I actually describe in my book, and which I was one of the persons who pioneered those tactics. So you use concentrations of force, and this concentration allows you to have a favorable correlation of drone forces, local correlation. You isolate the battlefield, you destroy enemy drone operators, their launch sites and control centers, and then you move in the small infantry infiltration groups, which can be motorized and can be just small infantry groups hiding in the cover of tree lines and urban terrain.
Well, we'll come to the sort of the big picture in a second, but let's stay with Fedorov, who you've mentioned. There seems to be something of a transformation taking place at the moment. Things, of course, are speeding up, going in Ukraine's favor, but it seems that the move of Budanov to the office which Yermak previously held, and now Fedorov is releasing perhaps fresh ideas or fresh impetus to tackle. And let's take some of Fedorov's first decisions. One of those, which is crucial, it seems to be, is also damaging Russia's ability to communicate through switching off Starlink one presume also as well. I don't know if Ukraine had anything to do with banning Telegram on the front, and there's this sort of internal paranoia that's led to the disruption of Russian communications on the front. But certainly there seems to be an extraordinary change which not only has helped enable, let's say, drone warfare, but also an attempt to sort of massively disrupt Russia's ability to coordinate, plan, communicate, etc., between its forces. How important is the combination of these things?
Yeah, I think that Fedorov has previously been in charge of the Ministry of Digital Transformation, and he has a lot of connections in the with the tech companies in the West. And think that a closer cooperation and integration with Western technology companies like Starlink, for example, really helped the Ukrainian achieve an edge and a competitive advantage over the Russians because even though Russia has China as its factory to produce fiber optic cables and other drone components, Ukraine can leverage Western IP, intellectual property, and Western technologies, and we are seeing it this close cooperation between Ukraine and Western tech companies really having an effect. And it's not just Starlink; it's also the Hornet drone, which is relatively inexpensive middle strike based on AI technologies. And so I think an even greater integration between the West and Ukraine can help us achieve a greater deterrence against the alliance of Russia, China, Iran, and other countries, because we see that the Iranian Shahid drones have really benefited from Russian advancements. They're not giving them the latest Shahid technology like Iran 2 technologies, but they are giving them some bits and pieces. For example, and not just Shahids, we see that Hezbollah is using fiber optic control drones. They're not in great numbers, but still they have some. And I'm sure that they have certainly provided the Iranians with that technology to deter a land invasion of the United States to try to unblock the Straits of Hormuz. So we see this integration between authoritarian regimes taking shape, and we need to counter that with closer integration of Ukraine, the European Union, and America.
You've also said in your book, and I think this is one of the central arguments, which is so interesting, that the war has shifted uh, into drones becoming, from becoming niche tools into the central operating system of the battlefield. But could we unpack that a little bit as well? Because a lot of attention is put onto the physical kit of drones, but it seems to me that there are several elements here which are incredibly important to understand that shift. Another is the advances in electronic warfare that go hand in hand with drones, indivisible, in fact. And there's one that gets almost no attention, which is the battlefield management systems such as Delta and the custom modules that are built underneath that, the layers underneath that for specific functions with particular battalions, different parts of the front. So what does that look like for you? This central operating system of the battlefield that is drone centric.
Yeah, Ukrainian drone forces are not only small quadcopters. So they are operationally integrated, sophisticated systems that include situation awareness software like Delta, combined with a large multitude of different drone types, including drone bombers, fixed wing drones, of operational and tactical and strategic depth striking capabilities. There's EW and EW electronic warfare that's basically jamming. It can be different types of tactical, operational, and strategic jamming. So you jam not only GPS, but you also jam the communication link between the drone and the pilot. And there are different ways to do that depending on what communication links they're using. So this is really very sophisticated stuff. And that's why the Ukrainians, and I had a personal meeting with Fedorov in early 2024, and I asked them to create unmanned systems forces as a separate branch of the Ukrainian military in order so that we could develop those complex technologies in an operationally structured organization. And also in order to have a greater impact, I proposed the creation of large unmanned systems formations. akin to the armor or tank divisions of the Second World War. So if we make an analogy that the drone is the tank of our time, so previously the drones were used dispersed and not in an operational integrated way. And I said, if you create large formations of brigade size, like drone brigades, you would have a first mover advantage over the Russians, and these brigades could then really achieve operational results. So if you concentrate, say, 1,000 drones on a narrow section of the front line, you create a penetration, which could invite some sort of maneuver warfare. You could roll up the Russian front line. And first, it was met with some skepticism. So I think that the generals of the old school say, oh, your drone companies per one brigade is enough. And then in half a year, they expanded Magyar's UAS company into a battalion, said, okay, battalions is more than enough. And then in another half a year, they said, oh, actually, that guy was right. Let's create a drone brigade. And the first drone brigade was created in early 2025 based on Magyar's unit. And I proposed the same thing. I said that we could expand the Magyar's unit into a brigade in early 2024. And I had a plan to do that within a 2 months period. And if we did that, we would have a first mover advantage over the Russians. So while the Russians had smaller scale units, we would have a drone brigade, which could then pierce the front line and create a drone-centered penetration. But the Russians had time to adapt, so they were mimicking the slow incremental changes by the Ukrainians. And so we did not make this drone surge, which could then qualitatively and quantitatively create an added capability to the Ukrainians, which could break the stalemate. And I think that the current drone surge that Fedorov, I think one of the reasons, I think Fedorov was for these ideas, but he was hindered by some more conservative elements within the military. And now that he's in charge of the Ministry of Defense, we see that the drone surge of the past 2 months is bearing fruit. So a radical increase in drone capabilities with the Russians. And it's not that the Russians are worse with their drones. They are also increasing their production, and their number of drone forces is said to be around 200,000 or more within a couple of years. So they're beefing up their own drone forces. And here we are always coming back to this important thing that for example, the Baltic states, there's a lot of discussion nowadays going that the Russians may attack the Baltics. And I would just briefly explain the rationale behind that move. So we can see that Ukraine is dependent on finances from the EU to fund the war effort. And without these funds, Ukraine would not be able to sustain war operations. And so it makes sense for the Russians to try to go against the Ukrainians' base, which is nowadays EU financially, and to try. And they see that because there were these iterations in drone technologies between Ukraine and Russia, there are only two countries in the world that have advanced unmanned systems forces. That is Ukraine and Russia. And so while NATO is trying to catch up, but it needs time, it has this window of opportunity between NATO builds its own drone forces, during which it hopes it can leverage its drone competitive advantage over NATO forces and use them to defeat and occupy the Baltic states, and then make an ultimatum that then Putin's gonna invade Poland, or you cut financial aid to Ukraine, which may provoke an internal crisis within NATO and within the EU, with some countries ready to surrender while others continue the fight. So it may create an internal strife within the EU and may weaken Ukrainian position too.
I mean,
And
that's of
that's
course, yeah.
his rationale, yeah.
Yeah,
And I
that's a
think,
dramatic scenario, of course. But the idea that Russia has drone forces, expert drone forces, and I've heard various things about Rubicon and their capabilities, but these drone forces would be larger than some or many European armies in terms of scale. Could we relate that back to the NATO exercises we've seen recently, where 10 expert Ukrainian drone operators using Delta Battle Management System or a cut down version of it was able to wipe out 2 battalions of NATO forces. There's now been 3 exercises which have shown the inherent superiority of small numbers of expert drone operators against large numbers of traditional massed armor, which are not, really taking account of innovations. If you have drone operators in massive numbers, I mean, how's this going to stack up against NATO forces? To my mind, this does not look good.
Yeah, these exercises have shown the complete mastery of small drones, tactical drones, over traditional mechanized armor forces and artillery. And so, artillery is still being used in Ukraine, but it's not being used like in traditional artillery manuals in battery formations. It's used as separate pieces, and they fire and they then move position. So, the important thing here is that doctrinally, the Western militaries, NATO militaries, depend a lot on gaining air superiority over the enemy in order to crush him. And here, the drones have changed the balance of power because the drones forces are so dispersed. So it's really difficult to track down drone operators, and they can use, and they already using civilian vehicles in Ukraine. The most Russian forces use civilian vehicles to some extent to hide their drone operator, and you do not need to have large physical assets like tanks or artillery pieces or a logistical footprint to sustain them on the battlefield. So even if we assume that NATO gains air superiority with its latest generation F-35 fighter jet, it will, and Russia wins in the land domain and in the near surface domain, it will still be able to occupy the Baltics, even if with the NATO planes flying overhead to some extent. And that is not far from given, because the Russians will try to create an access denial, area denial bubble over their land forces. But even if we come to the most favorable outcome for the NATO forces, that is air superiority, local air superiority, it will still be difficult to stop the Russian drone forces from destroying, because you see that 10 guys could defeat like a reinforced battalion or battalion battle group. Imagine what would a Russian drone division do, or Rubicon do. It's like 5,000 operators. And Rubicon, most of Rubicon forces have been pulled back from Ukraine. Their previously main area of operations was near the Pokrovsk region. I think it was pulled back a couple of weeks ago. And we do not really know where those are redirecting. So they could be redirected towards the Baltics. And we also see a buildup of Russian fiber optic controlled drones in the theater opposite the Baltic states, and we see the buildup of
Belarus, in
the
particular, that's
in Belarus.
supposed to
But
be massed. Yeah.
yeah, but I think that the Belarus is a feint. Attack from the Belarus, in my opinion, is a feint
Hmm.
in order to draw Ukrainian forces and draw them away from the front lines, and also to divert attention of NATO generals to the most obvious direction of Russian attack, which would be to try to cut the Suwalki gap or Suwalki corridor by an attack from the Kaliningrad area and from Belarus. But I think that, of course, they could send some forces there in the case of an invasion, but I think that the main force would be coming from Pskov towards Riga, and they will try to capture the high ground. And why Latvia is because it's considered to be the weakest of the three Baltic states militarily, and so they would probably concentrate most of their drone forces against one opponent first, and then once they're inside Latvia, they can turn up north towards Estonia, or can go south towards to hit the NATO troops positioned against the Suwalki gap, so they can hit them from the rear. And so we see that the Russians are preparing about a 200,000 strong invasion army, mostly based on the Leningrad military district, but also 2.5 corps from other military districts, some from the far eastern Vostok military district. And so they're really preparing for something. And they are really have upgraded their road and railway networks in the Leningrad and northern Belarus region, so they can quickly transfer the troops they're gathering in Belarus towards the Riga axis. in order to surprise NATO troops there. And the NATO are, I think, but there's a way we could counter them. We could send a Ukrainian drone brigade to take over the defense of the Baltic states, but they should not just come there to organize defense themselves. They should be given the resources of the local Estonian, Latvian brigades, and so to coordinate their efforts, because if the NATO troops will try to counterattack in, I don't know, in a company or of tanks, it will be destroyed. So it needs to disperse and conceal their own forces, and Ukrainians are masters of that, like to create a strong drone kill zone, which will prevent the Russians from invading. And it could also serve as a deterrent. So if the Russians know that there's a Ukrainian drone brigade there, they will think twice about whether to go ahead with their plans or to redirect their forces elsewhere. But and you can say that it will just detract from the Ukrainian drones in Ukraine. But to that argument, I would say that if we position a Ukrainian brigade in Latvia, for example, and in other Baltic countries, the Russians will have to counter that move with positioning their own drone forces against them, just in case the Ukrainians would attack, which of course is not the case because Ukrainian forces would be there defensively. And from the Ukrainian side, it makes sense to cover your weak position, like because NATO's eastern flank is Ukraine's northern flank. Because if NATO falls and becomes disintegrated, and the Ukraine will fall because it cannot sustain the war effort on its own because its economy is much smaller than Russians. And so I think
Surely.
that this can, yeah, I've already published a number of articles about that and have sent a message to that regard to the Ukrainian Minister of Defense. And so I don't know what steps are being taken. I have no idea. But I'm strongly kind of working as a Cassandra, trying to warn both NATO and Ukraine to do something about this and to deter any possibility of Russian move, which could happen as early as this summer.
I mean, if I've learned anything from this war, it's that Ukrainian Cassandras are essential for the survival of Europe, even if we don't realize it yet. There's another aspect of this which almost never gets talked about, and that is the fact that Ukraine already has the command and control structure to be able to engage with Russians whenever and wherever required. And if they were to operate in the Baltics, one presumes they would have to be given permission to operate on their own, in their own structure, their own way, their own framework, rather than the incredibly slow, tortuous, and absolutely, dare I say it, sort of not fit for purpose, sort of command structures, seeking permissions and this and that, and go through various legislative processes. How would that work? Would Ukrainian drone operators need to be given complete autonomy to import their own sort of hierarchy and command and control that they've developed?
I think we need to go even further. I think that the Ukrainians should be given charge of the local Baltic states and NATO contingents operating there. And I think that the Ukrainians need to create a drone-centered defense, and which could include drone-centered counterattacks with the help of land robots, assault land robots, and logistical land robots to sustain the effort. So I think that Ukrainians should actually share their way of war with the NATO countries. That's the only way the Baltics can be defended. Because if we take the pure number of resources in the Baltics, even if we take the NATO contingents into account, they are much less than what the Russians could concentrate by pulling away some forces from Ukrainian front lines. And the Russians are also betting on an element of surprise. And so by talking about this, we are also decreasing one of the Russia's advantages in this scenario, which would be that the West at least contemplates that an attack from Pskov could be contemplated, is on the cards, and it could be ready. It's half of the defense is to be psychologically as well as physically prepared. And I think that the Ukraine, of course, NATO would need to recognize that the modern way of war should be drone-centered, which is far from the case. Like I had some contacts with the top generals in Western countries, and the current position is that drones are important, but they are unequal to artillery, armor, air defense, and other forms of traditional warfare. Whereas I'm suggesting that the drone is the dominant player here. It's like the tank and the airplane during the Second World War. And they're saying, oh, okay, maybe we need some cavalry brigades or cavalry divisions to. You do not need them. You need to make the instruments, the modern instruments of war that are dominating the battle space already. The centerpiece of your drones, of your force structure. So you need to bet large on drones. And just to give an example, if you make the drones the centerpiece of your defenses, the whole position, defensive position changes, because the defensive fortifications that you build are gonna be centered on some bunkers, concealed bunkers for drone operators with concealed supply routes running through forested areas and with roads covered with nets, etc. Not just line fortifications of the First or Second World War style. So, and you would need to destroy like vegetation and cover, and at the same time make put some mines there. But the main thing is to create a kill zone devoid of any cover, which Russian small infantry assault infiltration groups could use to creep up to your defenses to infiltrate. So if there's no cover, they cannot infiltrate. Just to give an example with fortifications, but the same applies to the medical corps, like the evacuation of the wounded. Also, you need to give soldiers more skills and more capabilities to be able to do more, because the golden hour, like you need to have 1 hour to take the wounded soldier out, may no longer apply. So soldiers need to have more training in how to apply tourniquets, not to lose their limbs for maybe even a couple of days. And because it may be physically difficult to take a soldier out under a constant barrage of drones. And it extends to all sorts of like logistics. How do you position your ammunition dumps, whether they should be dispersed, how do you bring up supplies to the front line? So the whole organization, training, procurement, and organizational structure needs to change to adapt to the drone warfare. And NATO doesn't really have time, because Putin knows he has this time advantage, that the sooner he attacks, the better it is for him. And so the Ukrainians can come, because I think if nothing happens, like we are on the current course, if we assume that Putin gives and he's getting really mentally dislodged currently, we see that Putin is losing his mind. So if he gives the go-ahead for the Baltic invasion, I think that the Russia could overrun the Baltics, and then NATO will ask for Ukraine's support, but then we will lose 3 countries to Russia, and it will be difficult to get them back once the Russian drones get into them, and
And the
drone
panic in
operators.
Poland. I mean, never mind the
Yes,
panic
it
in
will be.
Poland with, dare I say it, some of my ex-Polish military friends would say, well, there'll be a lot of people who will be preparing to take the Russians on. There'll be a lot of people fleeing in the other direction. It will create an extraordinary economic chaos throughout Europe. But that's my question here is, can Russia achieve those same ends, not by a kinetic invasion, but by I think of it as a sort of drone Pearl Harbor, which is essentially a mixture of sabotage, drone attacks across European infrastructure, right across the continent, including air logistics and so on, and actually use what they're slightly better at, which is the cognitive, psychological, sabotage-based warfare. Strikes in a way that is unambiguous, but which our leaders have failed to grapple with over the last couple of years. Are these 2 alternative scenarios? Might the Russian military command be looking at other alternatives to a kinetic land-based operation? What do you see?
Yeah, I think they will need some casus belli, and they will have some hybrid operations in order to start the invasion and to make it appear as though Russia itself has been attacked, in order to isolate European NATO states from American support. So Trump would say, oh, it's your own fault that you attacked Russia, like he did with Georgia. And so I think that those scenarios of a large-scale, long-range drone attack and drone-based land invasion are not mutually exclusive. So I think one could precede the other. So Putin can say, oh, there are some Russian, Ukrainian drones being launched from Latvia. And he already said that. We will send 1,000 drones against Baltic targets, and if you deteriorate, you will face consequences. And NATO will have no choice but to kind of reply with the same. So it will send in its missiles against Russian targets, and then which could trigger a land invasion. Why I think that Russia will prefer a land invasion? Because NATO has its own pretty good conventional long-range precision strikes. Maybe the magazine is not too high, especially with the current war going on in the Middle East, but it still has some capabilities. And so it will also inflict some damage on the Russians, so it will be kind of a draw. Maybe psychologically Russia will have an advantage, but it will first it will create a chaos and panic in the Baltic states and in the wider European theater. And I think they could use this panic in order to start a land-based invasion, because they are if the drones are most effective not in the form of long-range drones, but they're most lethal. In Ukraine, there are more casualties from FPVs, and it could be a wing FPV like Russian ammonia lighting, but it's still an FPV. What I'm trying to say is that battlefield drones are responsible for like 80% of casualties, and Shaheds maybe like 5% or 2%. So the battlefield and middle strike drones are more effective, and so the Russia will want to leverage that, not just long-range drones. So and it surely thinks not without some argumentation that it could quickly destroy NATO conventional forces, and not only Baltic states. I think it will try to do a blitzkrieg against the Baltics, would then attack against Poland proper. And I think that what the Polish army seems to be doing seems to be relying on post-World War II concentrations of artillery and armor, and that will simply not work in drone-infested battle space. So the Russians will quickly, I'm afraid, inflict a lot of casualties on the Polish army and will push it back. And then this is exactly when the Poland and other European countries will bring in Ukrainian drone brigades to try to stabilize the front line. But first, Ukrainian brigades will be arriving piecemeal, and it will take some time to stabilize the front line. And second, Russia will already captured a large part of Poland and all of the Baltic states by then. And so I think it would be better to deploy a Ukrainian drone brigade now and pre-deploy some drones there, pre-position some capabilities, so Ukrainian drone force could be even beefed up to a larger extent if the invasion happens. And so, and NATO country, I don't know what they're thinking in Bundeswehr and in the Polish army. I don't know, because at least the British army are saying that drones are important and are an equivalent of the traditional branches of the army, like armor or artillery. But it seems like the Polish army is just using drones for PR only, so they allocate, and the Germans I think allocated about 1% to small tactical drones of their huge military budget for the next 20 years. So they think that drones will be responsible for 1% of battlefield casualties, or what? I'm not exactly getting what the Bundeswehr is thinking. I talked to a German lieutenant general, and he also doesn't have a clue what they're doing. So, like, they're not prepared for the drone era. And I'm
We,
afraid that it will be similar to how Poland tried to defend against concentrated German panzer divisions with their 11 or so horse cavalry brigades. So it's going to be
yeah,
carnage.
it's been pointed out to me that we need to be careful with that one because it's a myth of Polish horses attacking tanks, but I can see
Yeah, they use it
exactly the
for
logic behind it. Yeah.
Yeah, they use it for exploitation and trying to
Yes.
outflank your enemy for maneuver as a maneuver force, not to be deployed on horses, of course.
Yeah.
But still, it's better to use motorized or mechanized forces for maneuver moves than traditional cavalry in a World War II environment.
Well, we have to look just at the comments of the Rheinmetall CEO describing Ukrainian drones as being built by housewives who are equivalent to playing with Lego. Extraordinary hubris, extraordinary ignorance of what's going on, but of course very powerful than that ecosystem. This is the very last question here, and I think it's one that I see traces of, even if in Ukraine, the sort of debate going on here, which is that clearly the drone warfare has provided extraordinary defensive advantages, but the claim that actually when it comes to punching through, as you said earlier, and seizing and maintain and retaining territory, that actually we have yet to see a sort of combined drone arms develop that will create the offensive equivalent of the incredible sort of defensive capabilities that have come about, and that infantry, traditional infantry skills will have a role. What's your take on that? And are we seeing the emergence of combined drone arms?
Yeah, I'm one of the persons who pioneered drone breakthrough tactics in the Ukrainian army, and some of it, which is unclassified, I published in the book, and some of this has already been tried in Kursk and on a larger scale in Gallipoli region. So you create essentially the idea is simple. You create an overwhelming concentration of drone forces on a narrow section of the front, and I call this a drone blitz. So, and drone blitz needs to have some prerequisites. So this is essentially the first one is surprise. Then there's concentration of drone forces. Then there's favorable terrain and weather conditions. Favorable terrain, I mean favorable radio horizons for your drones mostly, but also favorable terrain for land assault robots through which they can traverse. And fourth is attack against the whole depth of enemy defenses. And so you can see that all four were used in a form of drone blitz during the current Gallipoli operation. And it not only grabbed back some of the attacks. So what we did essentially, the Russian group of forces Vostok has tried to envelop Orikhiv from the north, and in doing so, it has overextended its right flank, and we hit against it with the drone forces, and it's completely stopped cold their offensive, as they had to redeploy their own forces to try to stop our counterattack. And this gave time for Ukrainian defenses against the Fifth Army of the group of forces Vostok to be strengthened. And so this is how we essentially stopped, the drone blitz essentially stopped the Russian gains in all of Ukraine, we can say, because Russia tried to feint, I think, an attack against the Donetsk while sending most of its forces against Zaporizhia, and we rightly guessed their direction of attack, and we counterattacked them into the flank, and it stopped their forward operations, and they're taking off our land. And I think the next step, which you're going to see soon, I hope, is that Ukraine will drive back the invader in some form. So it could be with middle strikes, it could be with some drone penetrations, and it could be in places where the Russians do not expect. So it does not have to be in the south. So the Ukrainians could easily be trying to feint an attack in the south, but by isolating the area, but in fact can attack in the north. So if I were the Russians, I would not go into the adventures of trying to attack the Baltics, because in that case, if they attack the Baltics and Ukraine launches a major offensive on its own, their armies will be hard pressed. So if I were Putin, I would surrender immediately to Zelensky and would go out of Ukraine today in order to save his power.
Yeah, but of course, he's not getting information that gives him, I think, a view on what's going on, and possibly his commanders, even if they're aware of this, it's more than their life is worth to pass this information up. In terms of this sort of drone assault, things like electronic warfare suppression, and you've also talked about sort of massed drones on a sort of singular point on the front. Are we going to start to see more of these combinations of techniques and tactics?
Yeah, yeah, we'll see them. We'll see them, and I think that this is the only way forward, because static static drone defense is really not creating any favorable outcome to the war. We see that the war of attrition is really having severe consequences on both the Russians and the Ukrainians. So trying to treat your and outweigh your enemy is really bad on the people who are taking part in this war. And so I think it would be better for the Russians too if the Ukrainians defeated them quickly instead of prolonging their conflict. And if Ukrainians concentrated their drones at unexpected time and place of their choosing and hitting the Russians in the vulnerable position into their center of gravity, making a penetration and developing one of their group of forces, like we almost did with Vostok near Gallipoli. So I think if I'm the Russian soldier listening to this right now, or Russian analyst, I would be packing my stuff and trying to escape Ukraine as fast as I can, because things are gonna get worse for them.
That's a great place to stop. That is a very optimistic place to stop, and we love focusing on Ukrainian strength rather than endlessly talking about Russia. So this is absolutely brilliant, and this has been one of my most, I think, impactful conversations here. A lot of detail you will not hear from any other sources in this episode. Illya, thank you so much for your work, your service, and for sharing your insights with the audience today.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Khartia is a Ukrainian corps operating around Kupiansk, which is a critical area of the front. Now, this campaign won't be for everybody. It is a kinetic campaign in that we are crowdsourcing here for funds to buy vampire drones. 15, in fact. 5 of those have already been achieved in this campaign, but we are looking to scale this up to get the full amount of $40,000 US. That's going to Jiggers Paw that are handling this. This is an incredibly important campaign. There are many creators who are taking part in this. My view is that it's not enough at this point just to help Ukraine to survive. It's not enough just to invest in humanitarian causes. Not everyone's going to be comfortable with this, but they have to remove the invaders from their lands. To do that, they need the skills, the munitions, the weaponry to achieve that. This is where these vampire drones come in. So please, this isn't a full polished promo. I'm still working on that, but the campaign launches today. Please do check it out and, of course, help in any way that you can.